Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of LGOtv Big Talk. And why Big Talk? Because I hate small talk. So, my pledge to my listeners and to my subscribers, if you've subscribed to the podcast, thank you very much. If you haven't, please go ahead and do that now. My pledge to you is that I will bring you interesting people and have interesting conversations about interesting topics. And today's guest is one of those people. I first got to know Laura Huang on the internet. We were both writing books. We were trying to figure it out. She was just a little bit behind where I was in my journey, and we had a lot of shared experiences there. And her book, Edge: Turning Adversity into Advantage, is a book that you have to read. It was the right book when it came out, what, like 9 months ago, and it is even more the right book right now because all of us in this moment are dealing with adversity and trying to figure out how to turn it into advantage. And it's not just one of those like soul-sucking self-help books that's like, yay, you can do well. She's a professor at Harvard. She was a professor at Wharton. She's one of the top business school professors in the country. So she knows what she's talking about. So this book is based on research. It is based on her own experience. And I can't wait to have this conversation today. So Laura's Unite. Here we are
I
together.
know, and that was part of what brought us together too, is I was like, look at this badass woman whose name is Laura, who's like kicking butt. And it was just so fun watching your journey as well. And so that's how we had really met, was like I reached out to you and we had like some great sort of shared experiences. And so such a pleasure to like see your journey and see where you are now and with this podcast. So thank you for having me.
Oh, well, I'm super excited to have this conversation. So, as you know, I've been going through some adversity myself lately. I've packed on the spackle today, so I'm not scaring small children with my chemo red pocked face. But I talked a little bit yesterday, and I know that you watched it, just about how I personally have felt like a little bit of a fraud over the course of the last few months where I've been down. It's been hard. There is a lot of adversity going on out there. And as somebody who spends her time trying to peddle this limitless life, suddenly I'm like, God, this is adversity, and maybe I'm a fraud. And it was your book, it was your concept of sometimes adversity can actually become your advantage, which made me realize actually it makes me better. It makes me vulnerable, it makes me relatable, it makes it part of the process. So talk to us a little bit about how you came up with this concept of adversity being really
Yeah.
your advantage.
I mean, I think there was a couple of pieces to it. So, I mean, I had been doing research for a really long time, like over a decade, on inequality and adversity and people who are underestimated. And every time I would talk about that, it was like very, very depressing, right? So people would come up to me afterwards and they'd be like, like, what can we do about this? What can we do to level the playing field? What can we do to help ourselves in these situations? And so many of the solutions that we have, like so much of the research is about structural solutions, things that are out of our control. Things like, well, let's try and be more equitable in our hiring practices. Let's try and form, better networks. Let's have more people in top management team positions. Like, let's think about diversity and inclusion and all these sort of things. But, we've been talking about this for a really long time, like years. And sometimes things change. Other times they change, but with unintended consequences. And other times they sort of change, but far too slowly. So really the last couple of years of my work has all been about how do we flip things to our own advantage? How do we empower ourselves so that we can turn stereotypes and flip them to our advantage, or take obstacles or constraints? And so it was a lot of those types of things. But the other piece of it was that we sometimes, like, we're very apologetic when we are feeling down, or like society right now there's such a premium on people who are uplifting and trying to do big things, and we don't even give ourselves the permission to show our vulnerability, or permission to show when we are facing adversity and obstacles. And I think part of it is when we talk about opportunities, we think about opportunities as being opportunistic. And there's almost like this negative connotation that comes along with it. So it's like this whole, we're like humble bragging. We're afraid to be, we're afraid to brag because we don't want to be seen as bragging, but we also don't. And so there's like all of these challenges, and that's really what I want to dig into, that we can empower ourselves, that we can face adversity and challenges and do it in our own way. And I think that's what I really love about like both of our mutual work, right? Like that you can be limitless, that you can turn adversity in your favor, that you can flip things around so that you can gain your own edge. And it's particularly the case now when we are feeling down, that we give ourselves permission to absorb all of these emotions and all of these feelings and the ups and the downs, because we're so often binary in our lives. Like, is this good? Is this bad? Is this right or this wrong? And there's just so many shades of gray. So the way in which we process these shades of gray is how we gain our edge.
So let's talk a little bit about the hiring practice. So you
Yeah.
said earlier that sometimes you make these changes and they have unintended consequences. So as you know, I spent 20 years in executive search,
Yeah.
and we would have clients all the time say, "I want a diverse pool. I want a diverse hire." And I'm like, "A hire can't be diverse. That's diversity is not a trait of an individual. That's not how it
Right.
works." And so I would ask them questions like, "Well, why do you want diversity on your team? Why do you want
Right.
to make your team more diverse?" And they would say things which would ring hollow to me, like, "Well, I want somebody that reflects the experience of our, of the people we're trying to serve in this nonprofit." And I'm like, "Well, just
Yeah.
because they have this color skin and your clients have that color skin doesn't mean they have anything in common." Like, the African American guy who grew up the son of two lawyers who went to, private school in
Right.
Chevy
Right.
Chase, Maine, may not reflect the experience of the people that you're trying to serve more than, the Irish kid whose, parents, emigrated to this country who, put him through school, job, and odd jobs, but he's,
Right.
as, white as can be. So we have this thing where we say, "Well, I really want to bring somebody in who's different, who brings all of this stuff there." And then we bring them in and suddenly we want them to like get along with everyone else. "I don't see color. There's nothing that's different between us." When in fact, the "I don't see color" is so offensive because it says that the thing that you bring that's different to the table is something I don't actually honor and I don't actually think is going to help us. So how do we live with the adversity and the difference and what makes us unique and makes us special in a world that gives a lot of lip service to it, but once you get to the C-suite is like, "Yeah, but just go along to get along. We want
Yeah.
change, but not that kind of change."
I mean, there's like this, there's so many layers to this onion, right? I mean, because there's number one, there's just so much virtue signaling going on these
Mhm.
days, right? Like, so it's, we know what the right things to say are, we know what we're supposed to say, but it's so hard to know, like, how are we making sustainable change? How are we actually thinking about this? In terms of hiring, like, people put together job descriptions all the time and they have no idea what they're actually looking for, right? People who are tasked with putting job descriptions, what do? The first thing they do is they go and find other job descriptions, and they're going to then just copy and paste. Like, I want an out of the box thinker. I want someone who's diverse, someone who's like, detail oriented, whatever the case may be. We just copy and paste what other people want. And then when we're doing the hiring, we just sort of use these like shortcuts, or we sort of take, is this person a cultural fit? That's not going to help anyone. And what organizations forget is also that this has to be from the outside in as well as the inside out, right? What I mean by that is it has to be an organization trying to find the right, like the right people, the right talent from what they need as an organization, and then trying to distill that into what they're looking for as an individual. But the individuals are also enacting change within the organization, right? From the inside out. And so we don't really have those sort of conversations around what does that change look like? How is this evolving over time? What are we trying to do here? And so a lot of my research looks at the importance of signals and perceptions and cues and these implicit sort of things that drive change, right? And the main point of most of my work is that we know that this is not a meritocratic world. We can try and tell ourselves that it is, but it's not. And the sooner we acknowledge that, the sooner we acknowledge truths, like basic truths, like hard work alone is not enough. right?
Mhm.
But we so often, like, that's what we teach our children. That's what I teach my children, right? Just work hard, just work hard. And we have such a love affair with hard work and grit and like, and that's not to say they're not important, right?
No,
They're
but it's
critical.
malpractice parenting to say,
Yeah,
like, "Just
I
work
mean,
hard and it'll be fine."
exactly. I mean, these are critical things. I would never say hard work and grit are not critical, but hard work alone is not enough because you can take two different people who work just as hard as each other, and one will ultimately be more successful than the other. And why is that? It's because success and outcomes are not determined just by hard work. They're
Mhm.
determined by signals and perceptions and cues and attributions, and those are the things that we need to be able to flip in our favor so that our hard work actually works harder for us. Because otherwise, we have a whole generation, we have all these people who are working twice as hard for half the benefit, burning out, frustrated, jaded, bitter because of this sort of notion that we've been taught, which is that just keep working hard and it'll pay off. And
Mm.
so that's what I think, even when we're hiring, when we're trying to figure these sort of things out, is being understanding that we're not just looking for a unitary set of characteristics, that there's so many signals and cues that are driving our decisions.
So, how do we understand then, like, what our role is in that? Because there is so much responsibility. Like, if you're saying
Yeah,
it's, from the outside and the inside out, I could do everything that I need to do it right, and if it's if I'm not getting through, I'm not getting through. So
yeah.
how do we work smarter, as you said, and not bang our heads against the wall, but also stay true to who we are?
Yeah, so let me give you an example of this. Like, so I find in my research, for example, that people, when they're like, let's say they're in an interview situation, that people are more likely to get asked based on who you are, what you look like, what your background is. There are two different types of questions, and you're more likely to get asked one set over another set of question based on how you look, how you behave, how you speak, all of those sort of things. Okay,
Hmm.
so some people get asked what are called promotion focused questions, which are questions around like your vision, how big you could take something, where you're going to go in the next 5 years, the opportunities that are available to you. Some people are more likely to get asked what are called prevention focused questions, questions that are about the risks, the drawbacks, your weaknesses, where you see the challenges, right? So based on who you are, what I find in my research is that women are more likely to get asked prevention focused questions. People of color are more likely to get asked prevention focused questions. People with technology backgrounds are more likely to get asked prevention questions based on your age, your class, your
Hmm.
race, your sexual orientation. You're more likely to get asked prevention focused questions, questions around the risks, the drawbacks. Did you test this? What other challenges do you foresee? What competitors are in the market? And what happens is that when you're asked a prevention focused question, you answer in turn. You stay at that prevention level. But what I find through my research is that if you recognize this and you flip it, so as soon as you recognize that you're getting asked a prevention focused question, you answer it, but you do so quickly and then flip it to a promotion oriented response. So, for example, if you're getting asked about competitors and you're an entrepreneur, you say something like, yes, there are a lot of competitors in this market. But what our product is able to do is all of these things that allow us to go after these new
Mhm.
opportunities and these new markets. You've now flipped it to a promotion oriented response. And those entrepreneurs are more likely to get funding than even those who are originally just asked promotion focused questions. You can flip things in your favor. Now, from the standpoint of a hiring manager, you actually get better people if you recognize, for example, that a candidate seems to be staying very much at the promotion level or very much at the prevention level. Like they're talking about their experience, their nitty gritty of their projects. Well, you
Hmm.
ask them, like, what kind of ambitions do you think? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? You also get a sense for those promotion oriented things. And vice versa, if someone's staying very abstract and at the vision, right, you drill down and you try and ask them prevention oriented questions. And what I find in my research is that you then make better hires. You then are able to get beyond sort of, is this a cultural fit? Is this the diversity hire? All of those things, because you are naturally diversifying the types of questions and the responses and the way that you interact. So we have deeper, richer interpersonal interactions with our counterpart when we're able to sort of flip the script a little bit, and engage in this sort of understanding of each other.
So that's simply brilliant. I have noticed in politics, where I spend a lot of time, that
Yeah.
men get questions about confidence, and women get questions about competence. Right,
Yes.
so it's the
Yes.
same thing. It's promotion versus prevention, and I've never thought about it in those terms. I've always told job seekers that if they really want to practice interviewing, they should watch presidential debates. They should watch
Hmm.
political debates, because you'll get a question like, "Well, let me ask you this question about blah blah blah, the economy," and all of a sudden the candidate's like, "Before I answer that, I would just like to thank the good people of Indiana for having me for this debate, and especially the women voters of Indiana, because I care about women's issues." And then they like shift back to the economy. But it's like you can answer the question you want to answer, but you have to give lip service and honor the question that was asked, but then move on to what
Yeah,
you
you
actually want to
answer the
say.
question, like you answer the question, but you do so quickly. And and sort of political debates, right? Can't like these are this is a great opportunity to sort of view that. We see that, we've seen that, right? Who stays at the promotion level? Who stays at the prevention level? What are expectations? So lots of my work also looks at congruence, right?
Hmm.
What are our expectations of how a woman candidate should be behaving? What are our expectations of how they should look, how they should be speaking, how they should be communicating, how
Yeah.
they should, all of the things, right? We know lots of things about this warmth versus competence,
Or
the double
plans versus
bind.
vision, right? That's
Yeah,
the big
yeah, for
difference.
sure, for sure. And like, who are you ultimately going to vote for? Who are you ultimately going to invest in? Who are you ultimately going to hire? It's always going to be that person who seems like they've got that vision, that opportunity, that they've got lots of potential, but we don't understand that we are naturally leading people in that direction. And the fascinating thing is that I find both men and women, so male and female investors, are equally likely to be asking women entrepreneurs prevention focused questions, right? So this is not just a matter of, so this goes back to that inside out and outside in and inside out concept that I was talking about, which is, it's the solution can't just be, let's get more women in top management team positions. Let's just get more women as mentors. It's not going to hurt. It's definitely a step in the right direction, and it matters for other reasons. But that alone is not going to eliminate disparities and differences and disadvantages.
The idea of using this to create diversity is so fantastic, because if we're saying, one of the things that I used to get all the time is, well, I'll know it when I see it. And it's like, well, if you know it when you see it, it means you've seen it in the C-suite before. And
Yeah,
if you're
yeah,
telling me that your C-suite is a bunch of straight, white, cisgendered men, then you haven't seen it before. So you're not going to know it when you see
yeah,
it. But what happens is, because there are not as fat of pipelines moving
yeah,
up in a
yeah,
lot of corporate, nonprofit, public spaces, what we see is you see even in the interview setting, if you're asking somebody questions based on prevention, or even if you're asking them questions based on promotion, the candidates that have track record will do better than the candidates who have talent. And
yeah.
frankly, talent is a lot of the equation of what gets you, to be successful and where you're going. So
Yeah.
switching these questions around so that you're asking both prevention and promotion is such a smart way to ensure that you are allowing all of your candidates to really bring forward their best.
Yeah, I mean, and it gets tricky, right? Because we are talking so much about diversity these days that, and this is going to come off as way more provocative than I mean it, but we've also lost like the meaning behind, to some extent, around what diversity means, right?
Mm.
Like, we're now equating inequality with inequity, with diversity, with include, like all of these are sort of being lumped together, and we're really losing the nuance, right? We're losing the nuance between like what we're almost like dangerously now in going in the wrong direction, because now we're lumping everyone together. We're like, okay, now we need to, okay, this is now bad. This is now good. We need more of this. We need less of that, right? And
Hmm.
like, it's very dangerous because we're not seeing the nuances. We're not
Yes.
seeing like, and even in the reactions, right? We talk about like, okay, well, I mean, the thing is, bias, it comes in lots of different forms, everything from like the super violent and aggressive to the very like almost undiscernible micro types
Hmm.
of things. And so we also are not thinking about like the solution in terms of this continuum, right? We're almost like, we think that like there's some people who are, everything is like an aggressive reaction, right? Like everything now is like this very acute aggressive sort of thing. And that's fine if it's like for a violent aggressive type of act. But what happens is if you use that same reaction for something that's much more of a microaggression, you're going to stop conversation. You're going to
Mm.
stop like people engaging in certain ways. And the same thing happens. You have some people who are like, oh, well, let me just like help me understand what you mean by that, and being very gentle in the, but that's actually not the right reaction for that. You got to stop the bleeding, right? You got to stop the sort of, and so there's like all of this in between, and we're missing that. And so, in some ways, we're not having productive conversations, and so we need to kind of go back to like, if we acknowledge, yes, the system is broken, but we're not going to fix the system overnight. So how can we empower ourselves to understand our own nuances and the own ways that we need to create our own advantage, create our own edge, create our own limitless possibilities, whatever that is. This is a very individual journey. So, we can't lose sight of a piece of it.
So let's talk about this specifically for women, for people of color, LGBTQ. I used to say that I so when I would interview people, we would talk a lot about why they were doing the work they were doing because it was all nonprofit work. There wasn't, the fame and the glory and the money. It was because there was a mother, a father, a teacher, a mentor, a world tragedy, a diagnosis. There was a reason why they were doing this work. And more often than not, the people in my interviews would start to cry at some
Oh,
point when they would tell me about, their cousin bleeding out in their arms because he was shot by a gang member and him saying, I'm never going to do that again. I'm never going to let any of this happen to anyone else again. These stories that I got the privilege to hear over and over and over. But I will tell you that in 20 years and thousands of interviews, never once did a Black woman cry. Never once. And that, you name any, check whatever box here. Never once did a Black woman cry. And I think it is because there is even so much more expected of the level of polish and the level of perfection in the professional world that is such an unfair burden. And so
uh-huh.
I'm fascinated by this idea of you taking adversity and using it to your advantage, because some of that means you have to be a little more vulnerable, maybe, and a little
Hmm.
more public about it. Maybe you do it and you're not public or vulnerable, but I'm so curious,
Hmm.
as anybody in any insert protected class here, how do they handle the using this adversity and turning it into advantage in a
Yeah.
in a society that is expecting this undue perfection out of them?
Yeah, I mean, so this piece about like flipping adversity to your advantage, or flipping obstacles, or flipping stereotypes in your favor, that's the G of guide. That's the G for guide of edge, right? So the EDGE actually stands for the framework that I've been teaching, that I've come up with through my research, where just quickly, the E stands for enrich. It's how you enrich and provide value in any sort of circumstance or context that you're going to be in. The problem is that we often don't have the opportunity to show how we enrich and provide value, because we either don't belong to the right networks, or we don't look the right way, we're the wrong color, we communicate in the wrong way. So the D stands for delight. It's how you delight your counterpart. And that's the equivalent of like cracking open the door just a little bit, so that you have the opportunity to show them how you enrich and delight. The G is for guide. And that's what we're sort of talking about right now, which is guiding people's perceptions to who you authentically are.
Mm.
And then the final E stands for effort and hard work, which we've already talked a little bit about, which is in the framework that I've developed, hard work, effort and hard work come last. Like we often think it comes first, that if you work hard, it'll speak for itself. But in
Mhm.
fact, when you know how you enrich and delight and guide, that's when your effort and hard work harder for you. And the G piece of it is so much at the crux of this. So if we have, for example, a Black woman, or we have someone with an accent, for example, accent was one of the first things I studied, because what I found was that, well, growing up, all through my childhood, my parents, I was a child of immigrants, and my parents, had an accent, and I kept seeing both of them getting turned down for promotion after
Mm.
promotion after promotion. And during one of those promotions, my father actually, the person who had gotten promoted over him, who was now his boss, my father was actually doing his job because he wasn't actually qualified to be doing it. And everyone sort of knew that my father was more qualified, but for whatever reason didn't get that promotion. And so I asked my dad, I was like, why do you think why do you think you didn't get the job? And he's like, I don't know, it's probably because of the way I communicate or my accent or something like that. And I was too young to really understand what was going
Mm.
on and putting a word to what was happening. But way later on, I wanted to study this, and so I started studying accent and found, yeah, based on someone's accent, they're less likely to get promoted, less likely to get hired for top management team positions, less likely to get raises, less likely to get funding for their ventures, less likely to get asked on a second date, like all sorts of things that I was finding based on people's accent.
Is it
And
all
so
accents, or I mean, like, do British accents count,
so
or
we
is
studied
there racism in the accents
Yeah,
also?
so we studied 18 different accents, and controlling for all other factors, there was only one accent where you actually got a boost, right? So there was some like different situational sort of things, but when you control for like, background and education, all these sort of things, there's only one accent, and that was the British accent. That people with the British accent are more likely to be seen as intelligent, all
Mm.
things being equal. But everything else, like Russian, Japanese, French, all of their accents, we found that there were these
Hmm.
negative and negative sort of outcomes. And so then I was like, okay, well, is it about communication? Because that's the lay view, right? That if you have an
Mhm.
accent, you don't communicate as well. But we like randomized. We would basically have, for example, 8 people, 4 with accents, 4 without, present to a panel of venture capitalists. And instead of asking them whether or not they would invest, which we already knew they wouldn't, we just asked them, give us 3 bullet points of what you remember from this person's presentation, or 3 bullet points of what you recall. And we randomized the order in which they presented. And we found that they were just as likely to learn things and remember things from those with accents than those without. So it wasn't about communication at all.
Mm.
Instead, we found that there are these underlying perceptions that people carry about those with accents. Things like they're not as interpersonally influential. They're not as good of a team player. They don't think outside the box as well. So then what I did was I would have, before these accented individuals would go into an interview, for example, I would say to them, the one perception they have about you is that you're not as interpersonally influential, or you're not as good of a team player. So then they would go into these interviews and they would get asked questions like, so tell me about a time when blah, blah, blah. And they would like give responses. It was like so astounding. I would hear them saying things like, let me tell you about a time when I fought for resources for my team. Or
Mm.
let me tell you about a time when I didn't, I closed that sales deal and I didn't stop until I got it. And what I found was not only were they rated higher in terms of things like interpersonal influence, they were rated higher in terms of communication, and they were more likely to get the job, the raise, whatever
Mm.
it might be. So what I found is that there are always these lay perceptions, and then there are these underlying perceptions, right? And like another really, really quick example, like older employees, ageism. We assume older employees are not as technologically proficient. That's the lay view. Actually, there's one perception and one perception only. It's that older employees or older candidates are not as curious. So before they go into an interview, I tell them they think that the one perception they have about you is that you're not as curious. And so I hear them saying things like, I'm curious about your vision and how it's changed over time,
Mhm.
or I'm curious about your strategy and how it's been affected by the current circumstances. And not only are they rated higher in terms of curiosity, they're rated higher in terms of technological proficiency, and they're more likely to get the job, the raise, and so on. So we can flip things in our favor. We can guide people to who we authentically are when we understand, we've honed our ability to understand what are those underlying perceptions that they have about us. When we do that, we're able to redirect and guide them to who we authentically are. And this is about authenticity. This is not about being strategic or managing impressions. Like some people are like, oh, this feels like almost like gross, right? Like I don't want to be. No, you're guiding them to who you authentically are. You're not letting them write a narrative about who they think you are, but you are instead guiding them to who you truly and authentically are. So that's part of that guiding piece.
Yeah, and also if it feels gross, whatever. It's like it's part of the game, right? Like it's like people say to me all the time, like, "Oh, I'm gonna rally against this organization because there's no women at the top," and I'm like, "All right, well, I'm gonna befriend some of the guys at the top because the door opens from the inside of the room, right? Like there is still a game. Like I
Well,
hate
there's
money in
definitely,
politics, but I'm
well,
still raising money because it's a
yeah.
game. Like you have to win the game before you can change the rules."
Well, so part of it is also like everyone gets that there is a game, but there's some people just don't like that others play the game better than you do. And so there's almost like that, right? So it's hard to like tease apart what's actually happening, right? There's some people who just naturally hate the game. There's other people who hate the game because they're just not as good at the game
Yeah.
as others, right? And so like it's this whole like don't hate the player, hate the game to some extent.
Right. Okay, so I actually went to your site and I took the Edge quiz, right? So you
Oh,
have
okay.
I,
Yeah.
I did it this morning. So on your site, if you go to laurahuang.net, and it's here down for those watching video, you can actually take a quiz, which is very short. It's 10 questions, and it gives you your edge. And so I went through each of the, enrich, delight, guide, effort, and my edge is that I am a world changer.
You
That's
are,
the edge
oh
I
my
got.
gosh, nice. You're the
That is the
world
edge I got.
changer.
So
S-
it seems like I know what I'm doing in terms of enrich. It seems like
Yep.
guiding I'm pretty decent at. Delight I could use some help at, and effort, well, hmm. Effort's where I need some help because I am just kind of like a do-gooder person. Like I just like I'm kind of a nose to the grindstone, show up and do the work. So now that I have this, now that I understand my edge, when people go to your website and they take the quiz and they understand their edge, because I mean that's probably like 90% of the battle, right? It's
Yeah,
just to like
I mean, I think it's like how,
understand. What do you
yeah, so
do?
a lot of it is how well positioned are you? How well positioned are you to create and gain your own edge, right? And so, again, like it's these are 10 questions, sort of scenario based questions, like putting you in a what would you do in this case? What do you think in this sort of case? And so a lot of it is basically it is based on like situational, how would you react in that sort of situation?
Mhm.
So what the world changer is really about is that you know where you provide value. You know what you're good at. Like you
Yeah.
have a really strong sense of what your basic goods are. You also have a really good sense of how to position those, like how to sort of like know where to use those, know where it's going to work for you, where not to work for you.
Mhm.
Delight is really tricky, right? Because this is like, how do you prepare yourself? And this is sort of an oxymoron, right? Like, how do you prepare yourself to be dynamic, improvisational, like spur of the moment?
Mhm.
Because a lot of times what happens is that we plan and we overplan. Like
Yes.
there are some people who are like, okay, here are the 6 bullet points. Like I'm going to go into a conversation and here are the 6 bullet points that I'm going to say. Or if I'm in an argument and I want to convince my counterpart, here are like the 3 best points that I have. And then you go in there and you sort of give it to them rather than sort of dynamically iterating and pivoting. Although,
Mhm.
you're pretty good at that. Like you're pretty good at sort of thinking on your feet and just from what I know about you probably, but I think you're even stronger in like really knowing yourself and knowing how you provide value to others and finding that sort of way. And then the effort is like, are you putting your effort and your hard work in the right places? Because people who are super capable and have a strong sense of who they are sometimes spread themselves so thin. Like they don't, they sort of, it's like, it's like they know that there's so many different opportunities, and so they put a couple of, a couple of chips in this corner, and a couple of chips in this corner, and a couple of chips in this corner. They're like squirrels, right, that sort of store things in each of these areas because
Hmm.
they think that they could potentially go in any of those, in any of those areas. And so it's really like, are you focusing on the 5 to 10% that is
Hmm.
really critical, that it's going to, I mean, because when you understand the value you provide, to some extent, it's like you are a startup. You are
Hmm.
like a startup. And how are you really going to, you want to make yourself that unicorn? Like, how are you going to get those extraordinary returns? How are you really going to? So, are you spending your time on these like little things that are getting you, some progress, versus how do you really put that effort in a way that makes that difference? So I think, different people have different challenges, but it is, the strong suit is that you've already done like the initial parts. You have a strong sense of self and where you're vulnerable and what works for you and what works for those who are around you. And I think, that's the enrich part.
Well, to give a testimony about how dead on this 10 question quiz was, uh, in January of this year, I had a conversation with another speaker, a friend of mine, and I said, the problem is that I get on stage and I have to speak for 45 minutes, right? And I'm so afraid that I'm going to forget my lines that I now use slides. And then if the slides don't work, I get nervous and I'm trying not to memorize things that I don't know. And I try to get out there and just like be me,
Uh-huh.
but it's hard. And I had another speaker say to me, I watched your talk and you do this opening, this cold opening that's a little weird. And then, like 5 minutes into your talk, you start telling an LGO story and you are
Uh-huh.
so LGO. And I love that LGO, but I kind of hate the girl who came up for the first 5 minutes. So can you just get right to that? So my dedication this year was that I was going to just go out and be me from the start. And we were
Uh-huh.
joking around that it was going to be hashtag rant 2020. We're just going to get on stage and we're just going to rant. We're just going to like be all in. And you know the bones of your talk, like the 6 main points you want to get across, and then you just rant, you just tell stories and you're just all in there. And then COVID happened and everything got canceled, so rant 2020 got canceled. But as you know, I've been going live every day, on my Facebook page, and none of them are scripted. They're all completely just me talking whatever's in the top of my mind. So this year has almost gotten me to be better at feeling okay about being less prepared in the details, as long as I'm
Yeah.
prepared in sort of the overarching, big giant foundational points. And so your quiz was so dead on, because it was like, yep, you try to over prepare and you're still leaning on the hard work, but really you have to, push more into the parts of who you are. So I would really encourage anybody to go out and take this quiz, because it was just so just spot on with the things that I've been struggling with, and really a great reminder of what to do to change it. How many other types are there? There's the world changer. How many other edges are there?
There are a total of 6 different types, and so it really depends on. So there's 6 different types, and this is based on research that I've conducted, where I've done interviews on hundreds of venture capitalists and entrepreneurs and leaders of organizations, and the 6 types really fit. These different personas of what people struggle with and what they're striving for, and so on. So, I find that the challenge sometimes is that people do. I mean, it's not the unique thing is like most people struggle with something different from what you struggle with. They struggle with really understanding. It's so easy to say like self-awareness, 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 but truly understanding what your like basic goods are. Like, what are your true superpowers? And and I think you very early on, like as you kind of like from the quiz, like it's clear that you've sort of arrived at your superpowers, and one of your superpowers is like you're relatable. And when you are LGO, like when you are you, people, and I've even seen that honestly in like your writing, right? And other people's writings, like you're very unapologetic now in your writing. Like it's
Hmm.
less of a let me think about what I say, and instead it's like this idea is really important to me. So let me tell it in the way that I'm going to get the importance across, right? So sometimes your writing is like calmer. Sometimes it's funny and witty. Other times it's like abrasive and there's like F-bombs dropped
Yeah.
every other sentence.
Yeah.
But like, it's not about the writing or the style. It's about the idea that you're getting across and
Mm-hmm.
how much you believe in the idea or what it is you're trying to communicate. And sometimes you're trying to communicate something that's like more like meditative. Other times you're angry and you want to portray something that's angry, and so like that's sort of an example of someone who understands their basic goods. Because the thing is, it really changes. Like what I talk about a lot in like my research and in my book is that like you change one variable, you change the industry that you're operating in, you change the mix of people that you're with, and all of those perceptions are changing. Like you're going to be seen differently. And so you really have to hone your ability to understand how others are seeing you and how that works vis-a-vis who you really are. And so, you know, so like in your particular audiences, like you get like Facebook is a specific audience for you. These are people who know you more, who are
Mm-hmm.
going to engage in what you're saying more and really like understand something about you in order to latch onto that perspective. And a lot of people don't necessarily have that. So that basic goods piece is so important. Like I talk about it as like these are your ingredients. These are
Mm-hmm.
your like, so when my Taiwanese mother starts to cook, it doesn't matter if she's cooking a meal that she's cooked hundreds of times before, or if she's experimenting and trying to cook something new. She always starts with the same basic ingredients. She starts with like garlic, ginger, soy sauce, sesame oil, because that's the essence of who she is. That's the essence of her cooking.
Mm.
My Italian husband, on the other hand, whenever he cooks, he starts with like also garlic, but maybe like red wine and, you know, olive oil and prosciutto di Parma to taste on the side.
Mm.
It has a very, very different essence. And so different people have different superpowers, different basic goods, different basic ingredients. Even though those two cuisines overlap on garlic, they're completely different. And so when we see people or when we interact with people, we have the tendency to be like, oh, you're really good with people. You should go into sales. Well, that's just like so that's just so surface level, because you can take two different people, one who is like really talkative and energetic and empathetic, and you can have someone else who's like talkative and energetic but maybe a little less or doesn't have that empathy as much. And those are two completely different people who are going to do completely
Mm.
different things and have completely different trajectories. And so we need to understand both people's traits, how they're seeing us, as well as those trajectories.
What do you think is harder to identify? Do you think it's the goods that you have or the adversity that you're up against?
So I think the two go hand in hand, but I mean, I think the adversity that we're up against, we tend to be able to notice more. We hide a lot because we're social creatures, right? And so the things that we're truly good at, or even our underestimated strengths, we think we know, but we don't always know that. And the reason why is like we hear lots about failure, right? People are like, oh, failure is good, like embrace failure. The issue though is like we don't really understand what kind of failure we're talking about and when to embrace that fail. Like, because failure, the number one sensation or thing that we feel when we fail is embarrassment.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're embarrassed, we're the most likely to be like, oh no, never again will I put myself in that situation,
Mm-hmm.
right? The embarrassment is when we back away because we don't want to feel that uncomfortable feeling again. And so we say
Mm-hmm.
like, never again will I put myself in that situation. And yet we're so willing to say like, yeah, failure is great. We embrace failure. Actually, most failure we don't embrace because we're embarrassed and we say, no, never again. But so when we feel that embarrassment, that's when we should double down. That's when we should actually be like, okay, more of that, more failure, because that's actually that's where we are the most uncomfortable. And that's when we actually have the most data. Like you get the most data from those situations because it's things like, well, why am I embarrassed here? What's really bothering me? Why am I embarrassed, but someone else wouldn't be in the same exact situation? Or why wouldn't I be embarrassed in that situation and everybody else is? Like, what does it tell me about me, my beliefs, who I am, what I'm good at, all of those things? But we don't often do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, don't they say like 90% of people say that they're self-aware, but they only say that 10% of
Yeah,
other people are self-aware or something like that? Like
right, right,
somewhere in there,
right,
the math doesn't work, right? So,
right,
so,
right.
but I think a lot of times when we think about the adversity that we're up against, we point a lot of fingers and we're like, oh, well, it's obviously this and it's obviously that. And a lot of times we don't turn it back on ourselves and say,
Yeah.
well, maybe it's just because I'm an asshole.
Yeah, yeah. And we also let ourselves very quickly become entitled because if when we do face adversity or we face obstacles or some sort of unfairness or disadvantage, we are really quick to feel bitterness and
Mm,
be jaded.
mm,
And when we feel bitterness and we're jaded, we then feel entitled to some sort of like compensation in return, or like
mm,
we're deserved of something because we went through this. Like I do this thing with my students where I say, like, we have this one session where the first thing I do is I say, okay, I want everyone to think about a time when they were wronged. They were wronged by someone else,
mm,
and they were either stabbed in the back or like, whatever. And it still feels raw. Like as soon as you think about it, it still makes you upset.
mhm.
And within 15 to 20 seconds, almost everyone in the room can come up with and be thinking about at least one, if not multiple instances of where they've been wronged.
Yeah.
And sometimes it dates back to like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but it's still raw.
Yeah.
It's like this open wound. And so we talk about like, how has that bitterness affected us? Have we, and like asking yourself this question, like, is this making me bitter, or is this making me better?
Yes.
Right? Like, have I built up scar tissue? Like, it's still going to be there. There's still going to be but have I built up scar tissue in which this is making me better? Or is it still like this open wound that is still bitter? And that's what holds us back a lot. Like, we've all been wrong. We've all faced loss. We've all faced disadvantage. We've all faced inequality. We've all faced things that feel unfair. And we go through in our head like this, like almost like this mental like Olympics around who has it worse and how we've been wronged more than other people
Oh, I call
and
those
how
the
we're
oppression
not.
Olympics.
Yeah, yeah, oppression Olympics. Exactly, exactly. Like, and that holds us back sometimes
Yeah.
because the next time we have to fight for something, we're like, we shouldn't have to fight so hard. I already fought
Mhm.
for this, and now look what happened. But like there's no memory. Like success and outcomes don't have a memory of what happened to us in the past, and like outcomes don't have this like dynamic memory of what we're deserved and what we've earned and like the points on each column. And so this bitterness and this jadedness is really important to kind of also consider, and how that feeds into our ability to gain an edge.
Okay, so I want to push on this for a second because I'm a firm believer that you don't get the higher highs if you don't also get the lower lows. It's almost like you expand your ability to feel things in both directions at the same time.
Uh-huh.
I don't think there's any, scientific backing to that at all.
But
It's
we could
completely
test that if
crackpot.
you'd like. We could
Completely,
try and test
completely
that.
cracked. Right. But,
Yeah.
I mean, I sort of know when I also raising kids, I noticed it. Like, they get the highs and they get the lows. Like they seem to expand exponentially in that way. But for me, there have been, when you said that, like think about a time when you've been wrong, there definitely have been some things that have come to mind for me. Some things that I know absolutely with the mature part of my brain that I should just bless and release. I should let go. I should move on. I should know that it was all about their pain and not about mine. Hurt people, all of that.
Uh,
But then there's that, lizard part of my brain that's like, God damn it, I just,
yeah.
just want to just, push them under my thumb. And and I also think that wallowing in the pain and the bitterness of some of that a little bit has kind of helped me to find that deeper depth of the emotion around it that I might not have felt otherwise. And so can you get better without also feeling some of the bitter? Like, do you need to actually have the how much time is it okay to spend in the pain so that you
Yeah.
can feel the bigger emotions? Because as you said, with my writing, you've seen the evolution, that it's more honest, it's more raw. I think it's because I've let some of that happen. So how do you know how much time to spend in the bitter before you're like, all
Yeah.
right, get off your ass, it's just time to get better
I
now, like
mean,
move
I
on, let's
think
go.
like the bitterness is going to be a part of it, right? Like there's just like human, right? That's human reaction that when we've been wronged or something, like that bitterness will be there. And this is like extremely hard, right? This is extremely hard because like I can think of like two situations, like acute situations that still bother me, right? But like something that I do, right? I mean, like I think, I don't know if it's because I think very, quantitatively, my research is very quantitative, like statistically, but like I do this thing where something goes wrong, right? And if you think to yourself, like, what percentage of the time in your life, like, what percent of your life do you think things are going to go 100% right? Like, there's very
Zero.
few people, right? There's very few people who are like, so like, give yourself like a percent, like, what percent of the time do you think things are going to go wrong? Like, 20% of the time, things aren't going to go perfectly, 10%, whatever that is. And so like, sometimes things will happen, and then I'll just be like, oh, okay, that's part of the 10%. Okay, that's part of the 10%. Like, but what we do, like on an instance by instance basis, we're like, oh, that sucks. Like, this didn't go right. I really wanted this. But we don't think like, hey, let's just chalk that up. Like, I think I'm not going to get 100% of this. Not
Mm-hmm.
like 100% of the time, things aren't going to go right. But we don't think like on that aggregate portfolio level, like, oh, yeah, I didn't get this. I really wanted this. Or like this went wrong. Or like I botched that talk. Or like whatever. And you're just like, okay, 10%, like that, put that in that bucket. Right. And so when you sort of reposition it in that way, then you're like not as upset when like one talk just doesn't land, or like, one like podcast or one article or one whatever, one interaction with somebody. You're just sort of like, okay, that's in that 10%. And the same thing, like I do the same thing with things that go wrong, or people that have wronged me or whatever, or like what amount of time do you give? Okay, well, like something goes critically wrong, right? I'm doing, I thought that this paper or whatever it is, okay, this is like pretty bad. I'm going to give myself a day to wallow in it. Like I get a day to and I sort of like predetermine, like something goes wrong. I'm like, okay, so let me rationally think, how bad is this? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty bad. I'm going to give myself 24 hours to like be miserable, to be like, just like this miserable person, like cry, whine, whatever it is. But then I've given myself that finite amount of time. And then at the 24-hour mark, I'm like, you told yourself, like Laura, you told yourself 24 hours is how bad this is. Other things,
Mm-hmm.
okay, this is like about 1 hour bad. Right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I get 1 hour to like wallow. And then at that hour, it's like you predetermined, Laura, that this was like 1 hour bad. And if it's like really bad, okay, 3 days, fine. 3 days, you get to be 3 days unproductive, not a human, not around other people. But at the end of the 3 days, like I've already self-determined that this was like a 3 days bad kind of thing. And so now I no longer have permission to like continue to let it, because I should have taken that time in those 3 days to figure this out and figure out what was bothering me, figure out like all of this sort of things, because otherwise you just let it extend. You let it extend and extend and extend. And like, and so you let everything from like the small inconsequential thing that just sort of nags at you to the very life-changing like failure that really bothers you. And so that's sort of like the mechanism that
Yeah.
that I've built in terms of how do you sort of quantify this? How do you deal with like the bitterness and the jaded, and how does it make you better and not bitter? So
Yeah, I I love that. Whenever I've had like a cold or a flu or something, I've always, you sort of wallow in your whoopee clothes for a few days. And then there's always that moment when you're like, all right, damn it, I'm sick of being sick. I'm ready to be better. And you get up and you like take a shower, and the water hurts your skin because it's you have a fever, and but you just decide. You're like, I'm gonna will
yeah,
myself better, and it doesn't work. But at least at least it's like you
yeah,
have a moment where your brain takes over the heart. So I love on your website where you talk about you give your bio in two ways, and you say when your heart's leading your head, it looks like this, and when your head's leading your heart, it looks like that. And I always thought that was fascinating because my old business partner and I, she was very much a like academic. She has a PhD in psychology from Georgetown. She, private schools, all this stuff. And I am very much like street fighter in the gut, the whole, kind of thing. And we used to joke around that when we would make business decisions, she would always come at it from the academic point of view, right? She would quantify everything. And I always was like going from the gut. Here's how it feels. Here's what feels right. And we would notice that anytime I started getting very academic in my thinking, and every time she started getting gut feelings, we were like, oh, something's going
Mm-hmm.
wrong here, because we are not in the space where we operate, at our best. And so
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to think that this adversity piece is both, it affects both the head and the heart, and
Yeah.
there's two different parts of you that you bring forward.
Yeah, I mean, your head, like that's very much, my experience is that there are times when my head is leading my heart, and there's times when my heart is leading my head. And I think partly it's because, I am so like academic in training, like, being an engineer and being a professor and all of that. But I don't think that that's my natural. I also don't think that that's like part of my complete I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. I've never known what I want to be when I grow up. And I think that's been part of the challenge is sometimes people will say like, how did you get to where you are? And like, and it's mainly because I didn't have a very linear path. There was, I don't know if I want to be a professor for the rest of my life. I don't know if I want to be a professor. Like, there's all of these. And so there are times when, so when I was sort of writing my bio, like the bio is normally like, oh, like I'm a professor at Harvard Business School and I do this research and here are the awards. And like in some ways it just doesn't also feel like me either, because
Right.
it's not my heart. And then the heart leading the head, it's like, why do I do this? Why did I become a professor? Why did I do this research? And that is like all of the things. This is where I talk about like grow where you're planted, right? We try so hard to be we see all of these different people that are in different soil and different conditions and all of these, and we so quickly want to like displace ourselves and be that. But like really, if you think about a plant, like grow where you're planted, the stronger you grow based on who you are and where you've come from, and where like grow where you're planted, and then it's much easier to sort of take yourself and put yourself in another soil and be, because you're strong and you know where you've come from and all of those things. So I talk about like, grow where you're planted and know that life rhymes. Like the situation, sometimes you have things that happen to you when you were younger and it rhymes with, it reminds you, or it's similar to something that happens to you later in life. That's how you figure out those threads of your narrative, those threads of your life, that trajectory of yours. So, those are critical components of like this EDGE, knowing how you enrich and delight and guide and how your effort can work for you.
So let me ask you one question that I've been so fascinated with, because you talk a lot about how it's not just about hard work. You have to have all these other things. And you're a business school professor to millennials who are like, they expect to get the award the day they walk in. Like they're like, whatever, we know it's not about hard work. We're not doing any hard work. I mean, how does that conversation go? Is this like the way to think about how to create your edge for a new generation? Are they loving this? Is this something that all generations can work with? What's it like to be teaching millennials about how to do stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I love millennials. I think that they're just they're like fresh and they're energetic, and they're also like very easily like frustrated, and they lose confidence easily too, even as they pretend to have all of this confidence, and even as they pretend to have it all figured out. And so, there's a bunch of things that I sort of tell them. There's everything from the like empowering them, so that, because a lot of them feel like they've been hitting the same walls over and over and over again, and they feel like there's only one way to do things, and that so much of it is dominated by perceptions and social media and who knows whom and all of those sorts of things. So there's like this whole piece around empowering them to understand that they do have ways in which they're truly unique, their strengths, their underestimated strengths, ways in which they have a very unique edge. The second piece of that is that this confidence piece that I see millennials have, I talk about this as like, it's called the overachiever's paradox, right? And I see a lot of millennials have this, which means they sort of swing back and forth from these extremes, right? So if we think of sort of like a bell curve, and we think
Mhm.
of like there's this average, and on one hand there's like so like they swing back and forth between the 1 and the 10. Like, oh, I got called on and I didn't give a very good answer in class. Oh my gosh, I'm never going to get that internship and my life is a failure.
Mm.
To like, wow, I gave that great answer. I'm totally going to get that PE
Mhm.
internship and my life
Mhm.
is going to be a complete success, right? So they take like situations like that. Like, oh, this person ignored me today. Okay, my life is going to be a failure. I'm not
Mm.
good at anything at all. To like, oh, like I said that really witty thing. Okay, I'm like totally amazing. And now I'm like, and they swing
Yeah.
back and forth between these two extremes, because this is like that millennial mindset. It's this like overachievers mindset where like everything is either in dire straits or is like sublime, and
Mhm.
they bounce back and forth between the two. And so a lot of times it's about reining that in and just acknowledging, having them understand that there's this paradox that
Mm.
sort of happens in their minds.
I love that. I love millennials. I think they're pushing a conversation about purpose in the workforce in ways that we've never had before, and are so important. So I would love for them to find their edge so that they can start taking over some of the leadership. How do people find you? How do people find you? How do they find your book?
Yeah, so my social media, Laura Huang LA, my website, laurahuang.net. My book is conveniently, since everyone is in airports every day, it is in airports everywhere. I mean, it's
So's
like
mine.
I know. Like the publishers were like, "Oh, we're doing this big. It's going to be in airports everywhere." And then like it's like as of like March, it was like in airports everywhere. Anyone who's flying can see the book. But in lieu of airports, I guess all of the normal, Amazon, support your local booksellers, all of those sorts of things. So yeah, so our books are friends in the airport. We're
They
we're
are
like
very they're the only people hanging out in the
yeah,
airports
I
together.
know,
So,
I know.
our books, my book and your book next to each other in Hudson's,
Yep,
airports all over the
that's
country.
right. That's
So,
right.
friends, please support Laura. Please support her book that launched right before COVID happened. Please support fantastic female authors. It would be great. So, her book is Edge: Turning Adversity into Advantage. And thank you so much for being here today and for putting up
Thank
with my
you.
camera that, for whatever reason,
Oh,
keeps
no,
going
that's
on
okay.
and
That's
off.
okay. That's all right. Thanks
Thank you
so
so much.
much.
Bye bye.
Take care. All right, bye-bye.